I'm Trevor Phillips. This is Common Ground, where each week we look for agreement on a hot-button issue dividing the nation. Tonight...
This is not a bluff. The citizens of Russia can rest assured that the territorial integrity of our motherland, our independence and freedom will be defended, I repeat, by all the systems available to us.
Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Shuvash, Moldovians, all of them are Russians against you. We will defeat you. You will never win, not on your life.
Раз, два, три! Ура! Ура! Ура!
The United States will never, never, never recognize Russia's claims on Ukraine's sovereign territory.
We will not rest until Ukraine prevails.
We cannot, we will not allow President Putin to get away with it.
Putin bears full responsibility for this war, and it is his responsibility to end it.
And always remember, Ukraine existed before this enemy appeared, and Ukraine will exist after it.
Rockets are raining down on the Ukrainian capital in retaliation for the successful sabotage of Russia's bridge to the Crimea. The recent Ukrainian advances, far from deterring Putin, seem to have provoked the Russian leader into digging in for a long, drawn-out conflict. His new military commander's record comes stained with the carnage of Russia's campaign in Syria. The West's leaders say that they will stand behind Ukraine come what may, and that no privations we face could match what the Ukrainians are suffering. But many worry that neither Kyiv nor the Kremlin will settle for anything short of victory. Our choice: can we make peace with Putin, or are we in a war without end? In the next 30 minutes, we go in search of common ground. With me tonight, Lord Darroch, Kim Darroch, former British ambassador to the United States, and who was also the United Kingdom National Security Advisor. The Ukrainian MP, Lesia Vasylenko, and Evelyn Farkas, former Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. We know that we are at a serious moment. We know that Western countries have put their weight behind Ukraine, but it looks like some decisions are going to have to be made. So let me start with all three of you and ask you a simple question, I guess. Is it possible to make peace with President Putin still in place? Kim Darroch.
I think it's very difficult, Trevor. He has attacked a neighbour, completely unprovoked, a neighbour that presented no sort of threat to Russia. He's rained down death and destruction on the country. Set aside the military casualties, more than 6,000 Ukrainian civilians killed. And he is continuing to prosecute the war with extreme brutality. I find it hard now to conceive how any country can have any sort of normal relationship with this leader in the light of what he's done. It seems to me that pariah status is both deserved and likely to be permanent.
Evelyn Farkas, can you see a resolution of any kind with Putin still in office?
Well, Trevor, I think that peace can be forced upon Vladimir Putin. That is to say, if the Ukrainian military pushes Russia out of Ukraine, there will be peace. Short of that, Vladimir Putin is not going to give up, as long as he's in power, on his revanchist neo-imperial vision for himself and for the Russian Federation, which includes essentially control over Ukraine, and then Georgia, Moldova, the whole former Soviet space, and some influence also over Eastern Europe. And then if he can go beyond that, destroying NATO and weakening the United States. So as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, he's going to continue to try to achieve those objectives. And if we come up with some kind of compromise on the battlefield with him in power, I'm afraid that will only be a ceasefire, not a true peace.
Lesia Vasylenko, in the end, it will be the Ukrainian people's choice, I guess, about whether there is a resolution of any kind. We'll come on to talk about what might be possible. But can you see a situation in which Ukraine could accept any kind of resolution with Vladimir Putin still in place?
Well, there has to be a lot of ifs for that to become a reality. And if Putin agrees to those ifs, then of course there can be a peace. And these ifs include demilitarizing Russia. These ifs include denuclearizing Russia. These ifs include revoking all the legislative system in Russia, which has led to the possibility of this aggression, which include the trampling down on the freedom of speech, on various human rights, and on essentially creating a media propaganda that made this aggression possible. If Putin agrees to these provisions, well, why not? But before that, before we actually sit down and think about a peace agreement and the terms of this peace agreement, first and foremost, Russia needs to get out of Ukraine, of the territory of Ukraine. And all of the territories of Ukraine need to be liberated and back under the Ukrainian flag. And when I say all, I also mean the Crimean Peninsula.
If I'm hearing you properly, Lesia, the chances of the list of things you've just set out actually occurring are roughly zero?
You hear me absolutely correctly. I don't see how Putin, given his ambitions, his imperialistic ambitions, how he can concede to any one of these points. So that is why President Zelensky has clearly stated that a peace agreement with Putin is impossible, and there will be no peace agreement with Putin signed. We are realists at the end of the day in Ukraine, and we understand that there will probably be another representative of Russia signing off on the peace agreement.
Okay, so we've already established some common ground, which is not going to happen with Putin in place. So let's put him for one moment to one side, though I suspect he'll pop up again in this discussion. Let's talk about what the price of not reaching a deal might be. Evelyn Farkas, if there is no deal, what happens?
Well, I guess you mean by some sort of resolution. Look, what's at stake right now, Trevor, is nothing short of the international order, because Vladimir Putin is trying to rewrite Ukrainian history and essentially erase Ukraine off the face of the map. He's already tried to alter borders using military force starting in 2014 when he annexed Crimea illegally. And now, of course, he's trying to go beyond that. And the international community needs to stand up for the order that we established after World War II in order to prevent World War III. Because if you recall what I said in answer to your first question, Putin will turn around and try to destroy NATO. If he tries to destroy NATO, then we're looking at basically World War III again. So there's a great deal at stake here, and we have to find some sort of resolution. And my belief is the only resolution is to defeat Putin in Ukraine militarily so that he is defeated, at least in his political objective, which likely will mean, of course, that he is no longer in power in Moscow.
Kim Darroch, do you agree with that the only pathway to, let's call it resolution, is a defeat, a military defeat, I think you mean, Evelyn, for Putin and for Russia?
Trevor, I basically agree with everything that Evelyn has said, but since you're inviting us to speculate, let me just make this point, and I do it in a spirit of exceptional admiration for the bravery and skill with which the Ukrainian army has conducted this war and for the brilliant leadership that Zelensky has provided. But it's the Ukrainians who are prosecuting, who are defending their country, who are fighting this war. They're getting a lot of military equipment, especially from the United States. I think we're second in line in terms of supplying it, but it's the Ukrainians who are doing it. So we in the West have to recognize that it is the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian people who call the shots on this. And as long as they want to continue to fight, continue to drive the Russians out of their country, then they deserve and need our 120% support. If there comes a moment somewhere down the track where there is such sort of exhaustion at the war, which may be, this war can go on for a long time, and the Ukrainian leadership decide to go for some sort of peace deal, we in the West can't determine what that is for them, I don't think. We can offer them advice, we can offer them views. Ultimately, it's for them to decide.
Lesia Vasylenko, let's take up what Kim Darroch has just said. And let me put this to you. It's pretty easy for us in the West, I'm sitting here in London, to be heroic about the sacrifice of your people. But your people are dying. How long can this go on for?
Until the very last Russian soldier leaves Ukrainian soil. And Ukrainian people have been very clear about this. We are clear about this when we talk to each other, when we have these discussions in our homes, when we have these discussions in our communities. And we are also very clear about this when we speak to our international partners and on various media platforms. There can be no other way. If Ukraine was to seize territories or go into some kind of compromise or otherwise just put down our hands and stop fighting, immediately Putin will use this opportunity to wipe off a whole nation, a 44 million nation, off the face of the earth. This is his strategy. This is how he rebuilds the big Russian empire. And essentially, this means that Ukrainians will have zero chance at surviving. If we stand up and fight, and if we continue fighting, we at least have that chance of surviving. And I think in 230 days, we have proved that we are doing quite well. If we get more weapons, and I hope that that's not an if, but that's a when, we will start getting larger amounts of weapons, ammunition to go with, when we will be getting the fighter jets that we need, the air defense system, the modern high sophistication air defense systems. That is when we can make this victory happen faster. And we need a quick victory for the sake of Ukraine so that Ukrainians stop dying, but we also need this victory for the sake of the whole world so that we can go back to stability, so that we can go back to thinking long-term peace and strategic development in the conditions of long-term peace rather than in the conditions of war.
Well, let me put this to you then. You say to the last soldier, and that means, I think, to the last Ukrainian citizen. A year ago, the rest of us, not the Ukrainians, but the rest of us, didn't take him seriously when he said, this is what's going to happen because Belarus and Ukraine are really part of Russia. We should, I suspect, take him seriously when he says that it is possible that he might use what they call battlefield nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not going to ask you what the Ukrainian response to that would be. What I'd really like to know is what you think the West should do in the event that he realises that threat.
I think that the West should prevent the realization of that threat. A nuclear attack is not just one man in the Kremlin pushing one button. It takes time to prepare. It takes time to prepare the deployment of those weapons. And the intelligence systems are sophisticated enough to be able to use prevention mechanism. And when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal back in 1996, we signed a piece of paper called the Budapest Memorandum. I would be calling it an agreement under other circumstances, but it so happens that Russia, one of the countries that signed that Budapest Memorandum, actually breached it and attacked Ukraine. So I would say that if any international agreements are still to mean anything, it would be up to the US, up to the UK, up to the other nuclear powers to actually have a preventive reaction rather than a reaction after the nuclear attack itself happens.
OK. Evelyn Farkas, then Kim Darroch, what should we be doing now to respond to what Lesia has just said?
Well, I agree with what Lesia said, the upshot of it being that we need to work now to prevent Putin from taking any kind of action that involves the use of nuclear power. And that means we have to deter Putin. We have to do what it sounds like President Biden and his administration is doing, which is clearly communicating to the Russians the consequences, the cost of using a nuclear weapon. At the end of the day, that would be the first use of a nuclear weapon, even if it's just a detonation at no target, in the context of a war since World War II. The international community, I believe, would be outraged, and that would include Russia's putative partner, China, as well as the Indian government and many other governments around the world. At that point, I think the game would shift, and the U.S. would probably directly use conventional military means against Vladimir Putin's military. And I think the international community would conclude that Vladimir Putin has no right to helm a government on our globe, having used nuclear materials or used a nuclear weapon. Or
so to be clear here, Evelyn, we are talking regime change.
Yes, I think, again, any government that uses a nuclear weapon for the first time since World War II in the context of a war, people say in anger, whatever, whether you're angry or not, does not deserve to be in power. And I think the international community would decide that that was the case and find some way to engineer regime change, yes.
Darroch?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that so far, the US administration, the Biden administration, has actually handled this rather well. I think two particular strengths have been, first of all, the way that they used intelligence material to call out Russian preparations for the attack and really make this public throughout the world that this was about to happen. And as Evelyn said, a lot of people didn't really believe it would, but the intelligence analysts were right. And I think that the response, which I think Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was one of the main voices in this, the message that the American administration has sent about the response, should Putin use tactical nuclear weapons, has been exactly right. Some ambiguity in it, so Putin can't be exactly sure what would happen and sort of start calibrating for it, but also a very clear message that the consequences would be immense and immensely grave for the Russian administration. And you just have to hope that's going to be now.
The threat of grave consequences don't seem to have stopped him doing what he's doing. I mean, frankly, he doesn't seem to be even that bothered about the tens of thousands of deaths that he's visited on his own people. Do you really believe, Lesia, I'll come to you, do you really believe that the West saying these things are going to stop, whether it's Putin or someone else in the Kremlin, prosecuting the war in the way they have done?
Saying these things shows an intention, so it is already a first step. But then that intention needs to be followed through with action, and there needs to be a preparedness from Western leaders to actually go in with the action. I think that first and foremost, the importance is to strengthen Ukraine's defensibility, because Putin only understands the language of force. And if there is a force that can be reckoned with Russia, and if there's a force that can be pushed, that can push back his military and him as well, and his political strategy towards Ukraine, then yes, he will start reckoning with it. And if that means removing Putin, and I think this is the way that this world needs to be going if we are to be reinstating long-term peace. But one thing that I don't agree that was said just previously is that a loss, that the victory for Ukraine will mean a loss for Russia. No, it will mean a loss for Putin, but definitely not for Russia. Actually, a victory for Ukraine will also be a victory for Russia. That is for the hundreds of millions of Russians living in that vast territory, because that will actually give them a chance at freedom and at reinstatement of the human rights. I don't think that the 145 million Russian population is deserving enough to live under this autocratic ruler and under this regime. And I think that by providing a victory for Ukraine, we will also be providing a victory and a freedom for the 145 million Russian nation.
So it seems we're all moving pretty much to the same conclusion, that there is a way out of this, and that is if somehow the West, or indeed the Russian people, show Mr. Putin the door, and that he's removed from the equation. That's, in a way, the first thing. Let's take him out of discussion for the moment, and then talk about what might constitute a way of resolving the conflict with whoever happens to be in the Russian leadership. Evelyn Farkas, what do you think the West could offer Russia that would persuade it to back off, really?
Well, if we take Vladimir Putin out of the conversation and assume that we have a more pragmatic government in place, ideally, we would like a government that's not hostile to the United States and to NATO and to all of our partners around the world, a government that accepts the international order. And in that case, if the government is truly looking out for the interests of the Russian people and defending the international order and the principles of sovereignty, our work will be relatively easy. We will have to then work to help this Russian government reform politically and economically, essentially finishing the work that we started after the Soviet Union fell apart, but was really, frankly, interrupted, maybe was faultily conducted or insufficiently, the West's assistance was insufficient at the time. So we could, that would be the most optimistic scenario. Something less than that would be a not Western friendly, but pragmatic elite group of people who are close to Vladimir Putin today, but don't have the same, neo-imperial passion and are willing to accept the borders of the Russian Federation in 2014.
But Evelyn, do you think that's really realistic? Because one of the things that we do know about Russia, the Russian people, I should say, is that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a source of great resentment. And frankly, if you look at the attitudes towards Gorbachev, who's seen as the architect of that, you're talking about a people who basically share some of Mr. Putin's views about the place of Russia. So the whole idea that we might get to a new regime that, kind of completes the work of 1989-92, is that really realistic?
Well, really quickly, I'm going to try to quickly summarize history. Gorbachev, when he dismantled the Soviet Union, or when he allowed it to collapse, he didn't really have a vision for how to change what was left. And he did not have an idea. I mean, he was trying to reform the existing Soviet system, which was unreformable. So that the tragedy of Gorbachev was that he didn't know what came next.
All right, Kim, what do you think?
Since you're inviting us to sort of look into the future, Trevor, when Putin is gone, when some more acceptable, more pragmatic form of government is emerging in Russia, maybe with some democracy as part of it. I just offer two potential specifics, neither of which is really new. Somewhere down the track, once Russia has withdrawn completely from Crimea, from Ukraine, and once they have, I imagine, accepted they have to pay war reparations and this kind of thing, I think there are two things that the West can do to build a new relationship with a new Russia. One is that, remember back in the days of the United States and the Soviet Union, the two great superpowers, there were a whole raft of agreements about arms control, whether on strategic nuclear weapons or on conventional forces or intermediate nuclear weapons. And we could certainly, I would have thought, go back into that arena and see where there are ways in which you could reduce arms, maybe of all kinds, nuclear and conventional, and forces in Europe through a deal between the between the US and Russia, or between NATO and Russia. The other is, around the early 2000s, we were building structures with at the time a very weak Russia, which were binding them into, or an attempt to bind them into, Western structures. In particular, I remember a NATO-Russia Council that we set up. Didn't really get anywhere, and maybe we in the West didn't try hard enough at that time to make these structures work. But you could have another go at that and see if you can find some structures which would involve Russia, which would basically rule out the possibility of this kind of thing happening again. But as I say, that's both a long way down the track after you've got Russia completely out of Ukraine and done what it will need to do in terms of reparations and the rest of it to atone for what they've done.
Lesia Vasylenko, last word, really. Is there anything short of the list that you gave us earlier on, you know, the Putin gone, Russians gone from Ukrainian soil, denuclearization, potentially democracy? Is there anything short of that that you think brings an end to this?
Let me structure it a little bit better, because there's a necessary consequence as to how this peace can be achieved. So first, everything starts with a victory for Ukraine and its allies. That means, as we have correctly identified, all the Russians gone from all the Ukrainian territory. Crimea included, Donetsk, Luhansk included, all of the Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian borders are reinstated to their 1991 internationally recognized format, and then after this starts the points that make sure that Russia can never again be repeating the same crime, the crime of aggression. And this is where we're talking about responsibility for the international crimes committed by Russia, war crimes, crimes against humanity. This is where we are talking about tribunals. This is where we're talking about bringing people before the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. And this is where the reparations start to be discussed. And reparations that need to be paid to Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, for all the damage and loss, but also to all the countries that stood by Ukraine and that invested in this new framework of defense and security, of global defense and security. And these reparations, this is something that we really need to give a big think about, so that the Russian people still are in full awareness of the wrong that they did, maybe for generations to come, but also that they do not push them overboard to sort of start a new war again and elect a new leader who will try to bring back greatness to Russia. So it's not about humiliation. It's not even about justice. It's about really making sure that Russia is incapacitated and that it can never again rebuild an army and the nuclear arsenal with which it can think of attacking Ukraine or any other country for that matter.
Thank you very much indeed. Normally at this point in the programme, I try to see if there is some common ground between those who have spoken. Well, interestingly, there seems to me to be complete common ground between the three of you. Literally, this can't be resolved with Putin in place, or to be more precise, Putin in power. This can't be resolved unless the Russians essentially take their tanks off Ukrainian soil, and that there would then have to be some guarantees about the Russian power, nuclear weapons and so on, and reparations and justice. It's quite a big bill, and I think the one definite piece of common ground that you have between you is that right now the Kremlin isn't going to pay that bill, and that the strategy of victory is the only one available for the West and for Ukraine. Look, I want to thank all three of you for a really absorbing conversation. Now, stay with us. We'll have all of today's news coming up after the break.